In the primordial darkness of creation, when nothing yet had a name, when light and shadow still hesitated at the edge of each other, there was a place called the Garden of Eden, a mystical garden, suspended between the heavens, planted by divine hands with seeds of perfection. There, every living creature sang in harmony a song of peace, untouched by pain, unbroken by betrayal. At the heart of this garden, Adam and Eve came into being not shaped from dust, but born from God's very first sigh. They were innocence made flesh, bare as the morning dew, unashamed, untouched by desire. Each afternoon, God walked beneath the trees, his voice riding the breeze, calling the names of his chosen two, and they, Adam, strong and straightforward, Eve, radiant and tender, lived like children in a timeless world where winter had never come. But Eden was never theirs alone. Deep in the thickets, where the sunlight dared not wander, a third presence watched. Not a serpent, but something older, something far more dangerous, more beautiful than anything ever made. Lucifer, once the light itself, the first morning star, but he fell not from pride, but from longing, a yearning to be loved, as humans were loved. When Lucifer fell, heaven lost an angel, but the earth gained something else, a being who knew how to want. Lucifer did not walk. He slithered through prophecies, coiled in the wind, whispered through the bark of trees and the hush of streams. But what made Eve stop wasn't his voice, it was his gaze. Not like Adam's, no, it was a mirror, a reflection of her soul, turned back on itself. And in that look, she saw herself curious, naked, unfinished. "Who are you?" she asked, her fingers pressing against a heart that now beat out of time. Lucifer smiled. The air around him grew warm. "I am what you were never taught to fear," he said. "I am the question that never found its way into your conversations with God." And Eve stayed, not because she was tricked, but because for the first time she was truly seen. It wasn't temptation. It was encounter, a collision between a light long faded and a light just beginning to burn, a feeling beyond words known only to the skin, to the breath, to the trembling deep inside. That night, the wind lost its purity, the trees no longer swayed to God's rhythm, and the moon, like an eye too ashamed to watch, hid behind the clouds. The next morning, Eve said nothing to Adam. She stood in silence, watching the sun rise, her hand resting on her belly, a place that had never stirred before, now warm, as if holding something not quite human, not quite divine, something else. And from that moment on, Eden was no longer a paradise. The morning sun draped the treetops in a gentle gold, but to Eve, it was no longer light. Inside her, what had been planted wasn't sin, but a promise, a whisper that still echoed, even when no sound remained. It began with a voice, smooth as silk, thick as smoke, not forceful, not coaxing, Just understanding. Eve, Lucifer spoke her name like he had known it long before it was ever given. Why are you afraid? She froze, not from fear of the voice, but from how familiar it felt. She looked around. No one. Adam still slept beneath the fig tree. God had not yet descended. It was just her, and the darkness, slowly retreating from the face of the earth. I'm not afraid, she answered, though she wasn't sure who she was answering. Good, he said, because the fearful never find the truth. His voice came from nowhere and from everywhere. It flowed with the stream, hummed in the bark, resonated in her chest. Eve closed her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a different pair of eyes. Not Adam's, not pure or simple, but deep as the abyss. Eyes that had once watched the light die. Lucifer appeared not as a serpent, but as a man so breathtakingly beautiful that every other image dulled in comparison. His skin wasn't ash or coal, but like burning onyx, a black light with no name. His hair fell long and shadowed, like the very first darkness, and his voice, as if the universe itself had just awakened. Who are you? Eve asked, her hand rising to her throat, where heat now pulsed like fire. I once stood beside him, before you had a name, he said, stepping closer, not on the ground, but across each beat of her heart. I am the first light and the first night. Eve didn't step back. Something in him held her there. Not fear, but recognition. Not with the eyes, but with the soul. What do you want? She asked. Lucifer reached out, not to touch, but to trace the air beside her hair. I want you to look up, instead of bowing down. I want you to understand why you have eyes, not just a womb to bear children. She trembled, not from cold, but because for the first time, someone spoke to her as if she were sacred. Is there anything more forbidden than the fruit? She asked. Lucifer smiled, his lips curled like a tongue of flame licking the edge of the world. Yes, he said, when two creations, one from the earth and one fallen from heaven, meet at a forbidden threshold, when lost light finds shelter in your flesh, the wind no longer whispered, the trees held still, not out of fear but anticipation. Eve raised her hand, not to resist, but to hold that moment, the moment she was no longer just the woman made from a rib, but fully herself, whole, wanting, and then, in the space where breath met breath, where identity dissolved, Lucifer's final whisper came, soft as wind across her chest. You will not die, Eve. You will become eternal. She looked up at him, lips that had never known a kiss now trembling, and the forbidden fruit was no longer on the tree. Eve sat by the stream, cool water slipping between her fingers, but inside her, it burned like fire in the night. No one spoke of it anymore. Not Adam, not the fruit, not the gaze of God, but something within her had changed. And then Cain came. The first pain of childbirth was nothing like Eden's promise. It was not gentle. It tore through her flesh like invisible claws. Eve screamed not from pain, but because in that moment, she knew. The life inside her was not just a child. It was a consequence. Blood dripped onto the earth. The earth shuddered, and when Eve opened her eyes, the child lay in her arms, silent, not crying, just staring at her, as if it had known her long before she existed. Those eyes, they didn't belong to Adam. There was no soft brown, no innocence, just two black holes, pulling everything inward, the same eyes that had whispered into her in the night, between the wind, the flesh, and the dark. Cain, she whispered. No one had named the child, but the name came anyway, as if the earth itself had spoken it. Adam stepped closer, looked at the baby, silent, no smile, no blessing, just a nod part, acceptance, part denial. I have received a man from the Lord, Eve said, reaching for some way to name the unnameable, but her voice trembled, not from lying, but because she didn't know who she was speaking to. Adam said nothing. He walked away, and from that moment on, silence became their only language. Cain did not grow like other children. When they laughed, he only watched. When they fell, he didn't run to help. He tilted his head, as if studying the anatomy of pain. He touched the earth and it cracked. He looked to the sky and the clouds gathered. Darker, heavier, something in him unsettled everything around him. Eve still loved her son, but every time she looked into his eyes, she saw herself, not the woman of the garden, but the one who had touched what should never have been touched. She loved him, but she couldn't hold him long, because from the child radiated something cold, cold like the morning star just before it falls. One night, Eve dreamed she stood in the old garden, but everything was wilted. From somewhere far off, a lullaby echoed a man's voice, the one that had once whispered in her ear, Lucifer's voice. "My child has grown," he said, "and he will break everything you once believed was holy." She awoke, sweat soaking her back, hand pressed to her chest, where her heart beat wild. Outside, Cain sat alone, his eyes locked on the moon, unblinking, and Eve understood. Cain did not come from the light, but he did not come from the dark either. Cain was the meeting point between them, a soul caught between two realms, not blessed, not cursed, just uncomprehended. Abel was born like a soft exhale after a storm. No pain, no tearing. As Eve cradled the baby in her arms, she said, "This child doesn't carry the cold wind." And it was true. When Abel cried, the entire camp seemed to glow a little brighter. Adam's smile returned, and for the first time since Eden, Eve slept without dreaming of the dark. Cain watched his brother like a man on the other side of frosted glass. Not jealous, not warm, just watching, silently. Abel was light, gentle, tender, at peace with the soil and the sheep. Cain, as always, said little, but his hands knew labor. He sowed, he reaped, he touched the earth like he could feel the veins pulsing beneath it. But there was one thing Cain could not do: make God smile. On the first day of offering, Abel brought his firstborn lambs, wool white as heaven's snowfall. Cain brought barley in full bloom, fruit as red as spilled blood, laid carefully on the stone altar. But when the wind from heaven passed by, the fire rose only from Abel's side. Cain stood there, sap still clinging to his fingers, eyes locked on the cold ash of his own gift. God said nothing, but that silence weighed heavier than any curse. Abel stepped closer, touched his brother's shoulder gently. Maybe we offered it the wrong way. Cain didn't answer. Something inside him stirred, not envy, a memory of Lucifer's eyes, of that aching feeling of never being enough, never chosen. That night, Cain sat alone, gazing at the sky. But he wasn't looking at the stars. He was staring into the space between them where no light lived, no shadow reached. Only the silence he had been born from. The next day, Cain asked Abel to come to the fields, his voice soft, almost kind. "There's something I want to show you, a new patch of land." "It's beautiful," Abel nodded, trusting without question. His heart was clean, unfamiliar with fear, especially from the one he called brother. Out in the field, beneath the shade of an old fig tree, Cain stopped. In his hand, a stone not large, but sharp. "Why do you think God chose you?" he asked, eyes never leaving Abel's face. Abel smiled. "Innocent. Maybe because my heart loves him." Cain nodded, but his gaze had shifted. No longer observing, now judging. Then one swing, one gasp, a bloom of red spilling over the green grass. Abel lay still, eyes open, as if he hadn't yet grasped how love could lead to death. His blood seeped into the earth. The ground remained quiet, but the heavens trembled. Cain knelt down. He didn't cry. He didn't repent. He just bowed his head and listened to the ancient whisper, not from his mouth, but from the warm blood pooling beneath his hands. "Now you understand. The chosen one is the one who dares to kill an angel." As the sun sank behind the mountains, Abel's blood had yet to dry. It seeped slowly into the soil, as if the earth itself were writhing in horror. A life had been taken, not by time, not by beasts, but by the hand of one who shared his blood. For the first time in the history of creation, the earth knew death, and it would not forget. Eve's scream tore through the dusk. She ran, wild, through rows of trees, her dress in tatters, hair undone like a mother beast searching for a lost cub. When she found Abel's body beneath the fig tree, eyes wide, lips parted, as if still asking why she collapsed. Not from pain, but from the understanding that she had birthed death from her own heart. Adam stood behind her. He didn't cry. He placed a hand on her shoulder, then stepped back, as if he no longer had the right to touch this kind of grief. No one asked where Cain had gone. No one dared. He had left while the blood was still warm. He walked like a man no longer touching the ground. Within him, there was no regret, no joy, only a single question, looping endlessly in his mind. If God did not choose me, then why did he still watch as I killed my brother? The answer came that night. Cain knelt alone by the stream, washing hands that would never be clean. The wind held its breath. The trees did not stir. And then, from the air itself, not from the heavens, not from the earth, came a voice, soft as breath, cold as metal. Cain, where is your brother? Cain flinched, but he wasn't afraid. The voice didn't sound like Lucifer, nor like Adam. It was the voice of the one he had never seen, but always known was watching. He replied, half truth, half defiance. Am I my brother's keeper? A sigh answered him, longer than any wind that had ever swept through Eden. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. You have opened the door. You have named what was never meant to exist, death. Cain said nothing. His eyes darkened, no longer with fire, only emptiness. And then the first curse was spoken. You will wander. No land shall claim you. The earth will no longer feed you. You will be without name, without home, without roots. But I will not let you be killed. I place a mark upon you so all will know you are mine. Cain felt his skin ignite, as if carved by flame. His forehead burned, then cooled. A sign, a wound without blood, a scar that would never heal. No one knows what the mark looked like. Some say it was an ancient script. Others say it was the gaze of Lucifer. But many believe it was the mark of eternal solitude invisible to the world, known only to the one who bears it. Cain walked into the night. There were no farewells, no grave for Abel, no forgiveness. Eve collapsed beside her son's body, whispering. If I hadn't listened to that whisper, would you still be alive? But no one answered, because from that moment on, even the divine had tasted loss. Cain walked across fields where no grass grew, through hills where no bird sang, past streams that stopped flowing the moment they saw his reflection. Wherever his feet touched, the earth hardened. The sun no longer welcomed him, and rain, though it fell, could not cool the blood in his veins, a blood that never clotted, because it flowed from more than the body. He wandered, just as the curse had foretold. But deep within him, something else began to grow. Not remorse, but a hunger, not for food, but for something unseen. A hunger to carve his name into something that could not be erased. So he began to build, not out of faith, not for glory, but out of fear, the fear of being forgotten, in a valley between two scorched mountains where no one dared remain because the rocks bled red. Cain drove stakes into the ground. He dug foundations, stacked stone, raised walls alone. No one helped, no one watched. Only the sound of his own breath echoed through the night, steady as a backward prayer. He named the city Enoch, after his firstborn son, a child he had with a woman of unknown origin, a woman who came one moonless night, hair covering her face, and disappeared after birth. Cain didn't build for himself. He built for the child a monument that whispered, I loved once, even if only once. The first city was not a sanctuary. There were no temples, no altars, no place to look upward. Every structure was low, heavy, turned toward the ground, as if those inside needed only shelter, not hope. People began to arrive, the forsaken, the wounded, those marked by silence instead of blessing. They never asked who Cain was. They only knew wherever he laid stone, it did not crumble. Wherever he raised a wall, it held. And so Enoch grew. No laws, only silence. No festivals, only labor. No one called upon God, only one another in hushed tones, as if afraid to awaken memory. Cain stood atop the tallest tower, watching his son chisel stone. He did not smile. He said nothing. But for one brief moment, small as lightning after a storm, he thought, "Perhaps I am not entirely a monster." Then the wind changed. It carried no scent of earth or fire, but a whisper, an old one, the same that once slipped into Eve's ear, the same that once stirred the leaves of Eden. "You've built the first city, but you know this: what is made of blood will always be broken by blood." Cain's fist clenched. He did not answer, but something inside him cracked. Not out of guilt, but because he knew it was true. The city of Enoch stood like a scar on the body of mankind. Beautiful, unyielding, but never meant to heal. From it, a lineage was born, not one of prophets or saints, but of those whose blood carried defiance, brilliance, and the twisted light of their father. Cain's son Enoch grew up with skillful hands and a mind that burned like a furnace. He taught his sons to craft instruments not to praise God, but to create sounds no angel could mimic, from reeds, animal bones, and scorched metal. They fashioned the first music notes born of both love and resentment. A generation later, Cain's grandson Tubal-Cain forged iron and bronze, and with them, the first blade. Not to kill at first, but to build, to protect, to shape stone into the forms of their will. But every blade, sooner or later, finds a throat. Through the generations, Cain's bloodline continued to produce geniuses, makers, inventors, but also misfits, outcasts, those the world admired and feared. They built camps, they played music, they smelted fire from ore, and they challenged heaven. Lamech, the seventh in the line, was the first to kill not from jealousy, but from pride. After a quarrel, he raised his hand. Blood spilled, not one life but two. He returned home, lifted his chin, and said to his wives, "If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold." It was no confession. It was a declaration, an identity. The blood of Cain did not kneel, but that was the curse as well. For the more gifted they became, the more isolated they were, the more they advanced. The further they drifted from grace, the closer they came to angels, the nearer they stood to demons. Cain's eyes, those eyes never vanished. They lived on in his descendants, in the gaze of the first child to envy, in the hands of the first to kill for honor, in the sound of the first music played before the sun had risen, and somewhere in the dark, Lucifer smiled, not out of victory but recognition. because humanity had begun to resemble him, not just in their fall, but in their power to create, in their reaching for the forbidden and turning it into art, into cities, into blood that still flows. That blood, glorious and cursed, remains a warning, for all who carry it must choose to become a builder or a destroyer. When Eve gave birth to Seth, there was no thunder, no fire, no whispers in the wind, only morning light, soft as fresh cloth, spilling across the ground, and the gentle sigh of a mother who had once walked through the deepest pit of loss. Seth did not arrive like Cain, marked by defiance, nor like Abel, fragile and fleeting. Seth came like a lantern lit in the night, not blazing, but never extinguished. "God has granted me another child in place of Abel," Eve whispered. She did not cry. Her eyes were dry like the stone that once cradled Abel's head, but somewhere deep inside, a spring began to stir, not rushing, but steady. Adam lifted the child and looked into his eyes, and for the first time since they had been cast out of Eden, he smiled, not a victorious smile, but a beautiful surrender, as if to say, though we've lost everything, God has left us enough to begin again. Seth did not grow quickly. He was not silent like Cain, nor dreamy like Abel. He observed, he remembered, he listened, and every night, after the others had fallen asleep, Seth would sit outside and look up at the sky. "I want to know your face," he whispered, even though no one had ever taught him how to pray. Seth did not build cities. He forged no blades. He made no music. He planted. Each seed he pressed into the soil was like a message, a quiet hope that even in exile, good things could still grow if sown with a clean heart. And then, in the days of Seth's son, Enosh, people began to do something long forgotten by generations. They called upon the name of God, not out of fear, but out of longing. They built no temples from stone. They sat around firelight, gazing at the sky, speaking aloud the questions their ancestors had swallowed in shame. They had no angels to guide them, but they had each other, and a slow-burning feeling that the light was not entirely gone. Seth did not stand against Cain. He didn't try to fix what had been lost. He simply planted, taught, and waited patiently for the harvest to bloom. But deep in his heart, he knew one truth. This earth now carries two bloodlines, one of those who touched the angels and fell, and one of those who looked up to heaven and rose, and God was waiting to see which one could bear his light the longest. Time flowed like a hidden spring beneath the mountain quiet, deep, carrying with it something smoldering, waiting to ignite. The earth grew heavy with life, and humankind multiplied. But with life came the stretching of boundaries, and once again, heaven and earth failed to stay apart. Scripture speaks of a time lost to calendars, unnamed, when beings came down from the skies. They were called the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. They did not descend in glory. They bore no celestial triumph. They came like hunger silent, fierce, irresistible. They looked upon the daughters of men beautiful, soft as moonlight touching water, not seductive in shame, but beautiful in the way that precedes rules, that precedes sin. These angels known as the Watchers were once mere observers, but they watched too long. And then they longed. They fell, not tripped, but dove. They left their brilliance behind. They surrendered heaven just to touch. And when they joined with women of the earth, they did not only plant desire, they sowed forbidden knowledge. They taught humans to read the stars, to brew potions, to mark skin with ink, to summon with symbols, to draw fire from stone, and most of all, to wield light trapped in darkness. From those unions, giants were born, the Nephilim. Towering, mighty, half soul of sky, half flesh of ground. They did not know how to bow. They did not know death. They stormed through fields like tempests. Their footsteps made animals hide in burrows. These children were not demons, but they did not understand boundaries. They built higher than mountains, forged palaces from stone, spoke languages no one understood, and looked upon humans as fragile toys. The world became chaos, not from evil, but because all order was undone. People forgot God. They stopped praying. They turned to angels for answers. They no longer celebrated the harvest. They worshipped power. Even the line of Seth, though still reverent, began to sway under the spell. For who could ignore beings half divine, half human, standing on mountain peaks, commanding lightning with their hands? And then, one night, under the fullest moon, Eve, now old, her skin creased like tree roots, turned to Adam and whispered, "They're repeating my mistake, but this time, no one will turn back." Adam said nothing. He looked at the sky and closed his eyes, because he knew God was watching, not in anger, but like a father watching his children leave home and never return. That silence was the beginning of the flood. The ground trembled, not like a quake, but like a body shivering after a long, fevered sleep. Above, the clouds gathered, not to bring rain, but like 1,000 eyes narrowing not in wrath, but in sorrow. And in that stillness, in the place where angels once fell, where blood once spilled, where prayers once rose like fire, God said nothing, not because he did not see, but because he had decided. The world no longer recognized itself. The giants ruled, now seizing, devouring, demanding worship paid in blood and flesh. People killed to please the gods they had once suckled as infants. Mothers sang lullabies in the tongue of fallen angels. Children grew up in cities that pierced the sky, but bowed to no one except power. God was no longer remembered in love, only mentioned like an old name, a king long dethroned. And then, he did not judge. He simply opened the waters. They did not fall from the sky, not at first. They rose from the deep, as if the earth itself that once drank Abel's blood had finally reached the point where it could no longer swallow what had been forced into its belly. Water surged like pain long denied, from the cracks in stone, from the belly of rivers, from beneath homes and the hearts of burial grounds. Then the heavens split open. Rain fell like blades not to soothe, but to erase. People didn't understand at first. They thought it was a trial, then a curse, then something that would pass. But when the temple steps vanished, when mountains split in half, when the screaming was drowned so thoroughly that it felt like silence had always ruled, they remembered God. But it was too late. There was only one who had been chosen, Noah, a descendant of Seth, a man who built no cities, forged no weapons, played no songs. He listened, and when the voice came a breath in the wind, he did not argue, he did not doubt. He began to build under the sun, on dry ground, to the sound of laughter and the weight of mockery. But he built because he knew this time God wasn't coming to ask. He was coming to act. The ark was not majestic. It bore no symbol, no ornament, only wood, pitch, and obedience. But it became the last blank page floating on a sea devouring every bloodline. When the door sealed and the wind changed, people screamed outside, but Noah did not open it, not because he was cruel, but because he was not allowed, and the world vanished beneath the water as if God himself regretted giving life to a creature that would not guard its soul. Eve, if she had lived to see it, might have whispered, "I once opened the door to darkness with a kiss," but they opened the gates of hell with their own hands. Noah's ark did not drift like a boat. It hovered like a colossal coffin, carrying the last heartbeat of a world already dead. Beneath the ashen waters, thousands of dreams lay buried cities, monuments, instruments, blades, paintings drawn in light, the whispers of fallen angels all now reduced to a distant, muffled hum beneath the rising sea. There was no laughter, no hope, only the groaning of wood, creaking whenever the wind tried to snap the faith of an old man standing alone on deck, gazing into the void. Noah was not the strongest, nor the wisest. He was simply the last who believed God had not left. Each morning, he opened the small hatch at the bow of the ark, welcoming the wind like kissing a ghost of grace. Each night, he lit a single flame in the heart of the ship, not for warmth, but to remind his sons, his wife, and their wives that the light was not yet gone. Inside the ark, amid the roars of beasts, the breaths of elephants, lions, birds of the air, and snakes of the earth, was a world in miniature, learning to be patient. And in that same ark, Noah wrote not with ink, but with memory. They called us mad, but it was they who lost their minds when they forgot the name of mercy. The waters swallowed the world for 40 days. No sunrise, no dusk, only a gray dome pressing down from the sky. But then, one day, Noah opened a small window and released a raven. It did not return. Days later, he released a dove. The first time, it came back, wings wet, eyes tired. The second time, it returned with an olive branch. The third time, it never returned. And Noah understood the earth had begun to breathe again. When the waters withdrew, when the door of the ark opened, when Noah's feet touched the fresh, wet soil, there were no singing angels, no rushing rainbows, only the wind, and a silence so holy it could only be born from grief. Noah knelt, not to celebrate, but to say sorry on behalf of a world that no longer was. He built an altar, not grand, not ornate, and offered the first scent of a new humanity. God did not appear, but from the sky, a voice so soft it sounded like breath. I will not destroy again, for the heart of man is evil from his youth, but I will let them choose again with memory still soaked in blood and water. Noah nodded. He said nothing, but in his hand, the small flame still burned, the last ember of grace. When the final sun rose over a new world, the earth was still soft like the crust of warm bread, and the sky was silent as if it had learned how to listen. The sons of Noah stepped out, built camps, planted seeds, bore children. They thought the old has passed, sin has been washed away. From now on, everything will be as clean as the first rain. But they were wrong. Cain did not drown. He did not dissolve with the flood. Cain lived not in flesh, but in choice. Abel's blood did not spill only once. It became an underground echo woven into every decision, every jealous glance, every word that cuts like a blade, every strike of a hand that forgot restraint. The descendants of Noah divided the land. They built new cities. But then they began to build high again, this time a tower, the Tower of Babel, not to reach God, but to rival him, and in the clang of hammers against stone, in the upward eyes filled with pride, in the laughter echoing among clouds, Cain laughed back. He never needed to return. His mark lived on in every soul that had not learned repentance. From the city of Enoch, he never had to walk again, because each time one human harmed another with words, with eyes, with silence, another brick was added to his invisible monument. Abel's death was only the beginning, and that mark, the first curse, never faded. Not everyone bears it, but everyone stands before it. Cain is the choice between forgiveness and vengeance, between planting seeds or lifting stones, between the voice that rises from the soil and the whisper that falls from heaven. That night, Noah stood alone, watching his descendants dance around the fire, singing of newfound freedom. He did not smile. He only asked God not with words, but with his heart. Will they do it again? A soft wind passed across his face and whispered, They always do, but sometimes one will choose differently. Noah nodded. He didn't need to know who. It was enough to know that as long as one person chooses to forgive, to not strike, to remember grace instead of demanding justice, Cain would not win. And as night fell with fire flickering and wind brushing over the plains, Cain walked again, quietly, through generations yet unborn, not to kill, but to ask, what will you choose? You've just stepped through an old gate into a place where truth isn't black and white, where sin doesn't always scream. Sometimes it only whispers in a glance, and where angels, demons, and humans differ only by the final choice they dare to make. If this story left you silent in its final seconds, it's not because it ended. It's because Cain is still here in our choices, in our impulses, in the history we're still writing. This is Tales of Black, where stories aren't told to comfort, but to awaken. If these sounds touched something dark and quiet inside you, leave a mark, a like, a comment, a share, not for us, but for the other souls still searching for the story that might set them free. And remember, we don't tell stories to forget. We tell them to remember who we used to be.